We're all kind of detectives, right? We're always trying to figure things out to make sense of the world around us. But what happens when the most obvious clue, the one thing that seems to explain everything, is actually a total misdirection? Well, we're about to look at a few cases where that's exactly what happened. So, our first mystery takes us all the way to Tasmania, home of this little guy, the eastern quoll. Now, this small spotted marsupial carnivore just started vanishing at a really alarming rate. For scientists, this was a huge puzzle. You have what looks like a healthy population, and then suddenly it's in a total free fall. The big question was what, or maybe who, was behind it? And I'm not talking about a slow, gradual dip here. This was a catastrophic collapse. In just the 10 years leading up to 2009, the population of eastern quolls across the entire state dropped by more than 50%. It was a full-blown ecological crisis, and the clock was ticking to find out why. Pretty quickly, investigators zeroed in on a prime suspect, this nasty little parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. Now, this thing is known to be spread by feral cats, and it can really mess with some animals' brains. All the early evidence seemed to be pointing directly at this microscopic killer. Okay, so we've got our victim, the eastern quoll, and we've got our prime suspect, the parasite. The stage is set for a real biological whodunit. Let's take a look at the evidence that made this case seem so open and shut at first. And wow, the initial evidence looked really bad for the parasite. I mean, in the places where quoll populations were just crashing, almost every single animal they tested had the parasite. Now, compare that to these stable, healthy areas where the infection rate was way, way lower. It looks like a smoking gun, doesn't it? Case closed. But like in any good mystery, the first suspect is almost never the real culprit. And yeah, as the scientists started digging deeper into the actual data, the story took a very, very sharp turn. And this is where the whole theory just completely falls apart. The study found that getting infected had zero negative effect on whether a quoll survived or had babies. Actually, it was the exact opposite. Infected female quolls had more young, and the infected males were in much better physical shape. So the supposed killer parasite was actually linked to healthier, more successful animals. What on earth was going on? Turns out the parasite wasn't the murderer at all. It was the fingerprints left at the scene of the crime by the real bad guy. I mean, think about it. How do quolls even get this parasite? From its host, the feral cat. So a high infection rate didn't mean the disease was killing them. It just meant the quolls were spending a lot more time around feral cats, fighting with them for food, and, this is the key part, getting hunted by them. The parasite was just a signal of way more pressure from feral cats. So this whole thing boils down to that classic scientific mix-up, correlation versus causation. Sure, the high parasite rate and the population decline were happening at the same time. That's a correlation. But the parasite wasn't causing the decline. It was just a clue that pointed to the real cause the whole time. The parasite was the perfect red herring. It was this simple, obvious suspect that totally distracted everyone from a much more complicated and, frankly, a more dangerous truth. Which kind of leads to a much bigger question. I mean, what if we're constantly falling for these easy, obvious answers, these red herrings in all parts of our lives? What if the search for a deeper truth always means we have to look past that first, easy explanation? All right, let's jump out of the science lab for a minute and into the world of movies, specifically into the mind of the legendary filmmaker Werner Herzog. It turns out he spent his entire career wrestling with a very similar idea about truth. Herzog says there are basically two kinds of truth. The first kind he calls the accountant's truth. This is, the world of raw data, spreadsheets, just the facts. Think of it like that initial parasite infection rate. But Herzog says there's a deeper, more meaningful truth, what he calls ecstatic truth. And you can only get to that through things like poetry, imagination, and maybe even a little bit of invention. So on one side, you have the literal, rules-based world of just the facts. And on the other, you have a truth that's going for something bigger, a deeper meaning that really hits you on a poetic or emotional level. For Herzog, if you only stick to the accountant's truth, you're basically declaring the parasite guilty and closing the case file without ever looking any deeper. And this is just a brilliant example of his point. In his film The Enigma of Caspar Hauser, a logician poses a puzzle. You're at a fork in the road. One path leads to a village of truth-tellers, the other to a village of liars. You can ask one person one question to figure out which way to go. The logician's answer is super complicated and formal. It's the accountant's truth. But Kaspar's answer, it's pure, ecstatic truth. He just asks, are you a tree frog? Now think about that. The truth teller has to honestly say no. But the liar? The liar is forced to lie and say yes. And bam! You immediately know who he is. It's this brilliant, poetic leap that just sidesteps formal logic to find a way smarter, simpler truth. Okay, so let's take this idea to its most profound and challenging place. The question of suffering and the nature of evil itself. Because here, too, there's a huge temptation to just settle for the simple answer. When something terrible happens, the easy answer, the simple scapegoat, is often to blame a higher power, to ask, how could God let this happen? But the theologian Simon Woodman completely reframes this. He argues that this view imagines God as the one causing it, the one pushing the landslide from the top of the mountain. Instead, he suggests, the deeper truth is that divinity is found at the bottom of that mountain, experiencing the suffering right there with us. And he actually goes even further. Woodman points out that so much of the world's suffering, famine, war, is a direct result of human choices. So to blame a higher power isn't just a simple answer. He calls it an act of cowardice that lets us off the hook and helps us ignore our own responsibility, our own complicity in the problem. The psychoanalyst Jamieson Webster offers another way to look at this, moving past this simple idea of evil as some kind of external force. She suggests it's really an internal process she calls splitting. It's a defense mechanism where we mentally split the world into all good and all bad. We project all the stuff we don't like about ourselves onto someone else, a scapegoat, so we can keep our own self-image looking pure. It's how we create a simple villain to avoid facing the complex truth that good and bad actually exist inside all of us. So, whether we're investigating why a species is declining, watching a film, or tackling our biggest philosophical questions, this powerful pattern just keeps showing up. The temptation of the simple scapegoat. So let's just lay it all out. In science, the simple scapegoat was the parasite, but the deeper truth was the pressure from feral cats. In art, the simple scapegoat is the accountant's truth of bare facts, while the deeper, ecstatic truth needs imagination. And in theology, the simple scapegoat is blaming a higher power, while the deeper truth points to our own human responsibility and complex psychology. In every single case, finding the real answer meant refusing the easy one. Which really brings us to the final question we should probably be asking ourselves. When we look at the world, when we try to understand it, what are we really looking for? Are we just searching for that simple scapegoat, the answer that's quick and clean and easy? Or are we willing to do the hard work of digging a little deeper for truth that's more complex, more challenging, and ultimately a whole lot more meaningful?